The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Select Committee's second oral hearing. And then, so firstly, I'd just like to introduce the Youth Select Committee. So, my name is Rachel Loja, and I'm the chair of the Youth Select Committee for 2019.
I'm Susanna Single, and I am the vice chair of this committee.
Hi, I'm Jack.
Hi, I'm James.
I'm Ewan.
Hi, I'm Charlie.
Hi, I'm Bailey.
Hi, I'm Chris.
Hi, I'm Julie. Hi, I'm Husna.
And hi, I'm Thea.
So before we start, I'd like to thank our panellists who have come here and agreed to give us evidence. And I'd also like each of them to introduce themselves briefly. Thank you.
Do you want me to go? My name's Keir. I'm a lecturer in criminology with the Open University, and I've been supporting the Youth Violence Commission for the past 2 years.
My name's Vicky. I'm the MP for Lewisham Deptford, also chair of the Youth Violence Commission, and very recently appointed as part of the Shadow Department of Culture, Media and Sport team responsible for civil society.
I'm Sarah. I'm the MP for Croydon Central, and I set up the all-party parliamentary group on knife crime about a year and a half, nearly 2 years ago, and I'm a shadow housing minister as well.
Thank you. So just to start off, I'd just like to say the first question to the panel, which is, the Home Office has announced funding to support the creation of 18 violence reduction units across England and Wales. Do you think that there are lessons to be learnt from the Scottish violence reduction units? Are there specific factors that need to be considered when introducing the violence reduction units in England and Wales to take into account any local differences?
Yeah, sure. I think the establishment of the violence reduction units is a very welcome move, and that's something that we called for as part of our work on the Youth Violence Commission. But when you speak to the people who are involved in setting up the Scottish violence reduction unit, they're very clear that there's no fixed blueprint that could be transplanted from one context to the other. It's about a way of working, and that's really about taking a really long-term evidence-based approach. And it's something that I don't think we've been very good at doing in the last 20 years. So the fact that these units have been set up, that alone won't make a difference. But if they can take that approach and adopt a mantra that is long-term and evidence-based and it's bold and it's courageous and it does things differently, then absolutely there's huge potential, I think.
We're being very polite. I think a couple of things just as an introduction. One is that someone was stabbed to death in Croydon yesterday, and this is, you all know this, but it's a huge problem, and it's not going away anytime soon. And when somebody dies in your own area, it brings it home particularly, and we absolutely need to be doing much more, and the government needs to be doing much more to tackle knife crime and serious violence, absolutely. In terms of the government's approach with these 18 VRUs, I think one of the messages from Scotland was you need a really long-term approach. This isn't going to be tackled overnight, and the funding for these 18 VRUs is, I think, just for 1 year. It's £35 million for this pot of money. It's not going to be funding for the long term, and I think the complexity of a lot of these issues, the fact that no single crime is exactly the same. There are threads, there's evidence about correlations between different backgrounds that people have and different experiences they have and different life chances they have, but every crime is different, and every victim is different, and you need something that is tackling the long term proper. This is going to take 10 years, we're going to be in it for the long term, and I worry with the government's approach that it's quite short term, and I also worry, why are we only having 18, and why is everybody having to compete with each other for these little pots of money? What a lot of the London boroughs say to me about what has happened in the past is that when knife crime goes up, which it does, it goes up and then it goes down and then it goes up and it goes down, although it's not going down at the moment, and there's an interesting debate to be had about actually how confident we are it will go down in the same way. Local authorities or other organisations will say, well, the trouble is knife crime went up and we just threw out a bit of money. We said, here's a pot of money, organisations come and bid for money to run some campaigns and do some stuff and go into schools, and then it does get suppressed because the police resources are increased, but it's not really a proper strategy. It's not really how many children are at risk, where are they, how do we get to them, and how do we make this a long-term thing so that we're educating people who are coming through primary school right now to not get to that point. And they're welcome, but I don't think they're anywhere near far enough to actually fixing the problem.
In terms of the Youth Violence Commission, it was one of our top recommendations was around a public health approach, and I know that the Knife Crime APG went and called for exactly the same thing, and we all went up to Scotland and met with the people there, and one of the things that they said to us, one, a long-term strategy, so they had a 10-year strategy. They said if they were to go and revisit this, it would be a 15 or 20-year strategy that they should have adopted at the start. The other thing that they talked to us about was the importance of relationships, and what they mean in terms of that is, the bringing together of, the different agencies, the sharing information, the following the evidence, but also building up those relationships everywhere. So that's, in the local communities, because we can all do stuff, in our local communities, but we have to have those relationships and the ability to share and talk and work through what is it that we need to do. And in terms of kind of following the evidence, sometimes it very much is different in different areas. And they say, from Scotland, don't just do everything that we did in Scotland. You need to work out what it is that you need to do in different areas. But if we look at one kind of piece of evidence, we know our kids aren't safe between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. We know that that's when there is higher numbers of stabbings that are taking place. Yet we release our children from school. Release, that sounds really kind of like prison-like. But what if we went to be making sure that our schools were open longer until 6 o'clock? What if we made sure that everybody had access to youth work between those hours, and kind of following the evidence in terms of that way? But also, and the other important thing is these things need investment. And in Scotland, there was the investment there, and we need to make sure that there is the investment across the piece. And exactly what Sarah was saying, not just 1 year, one little splurge of a pot of money and then not continuing with it, but actually long-term investment and over the long run. Because some of these things work like a bit of a pendulum. If we want to go and save money in terms of police time, police resources, sending our children to PRUs, which are 3 times more expensive than schools, saving money in terms of the criminal investigations, that isn't just going to go and happen overnight. You need to invest and front load that funding for a number of years before you kind of watch, the savings that come in the long term in terms of making sure that, we're keeping our young people safe.
Thank you. So the next question, I'll invite Chris to ask that.
So my question is directed at you, Vicky, and the Youth Violence Commission interim report states that any future strategy needs to have the voice of young people at its core. What might this look like, and how should the government change the way it develops strategy to improve young people more closely?
Well, one of the things that we've gone to do right through, producing our report is make sure that we're, working with young people on it. I know there's a few people around the table that, I've gone and met, in other areas. And as we come to produce our full report, this is one of the things that we're really kind of considering. So we're working with UK Youth to kind of think about, are there ways of having young people take control of our social media in terms of the Youth Violence Commission? Are there ways of making sure that they, formulate, kind of what the forward is, rather than it kind of just being, MPs or politicians. Actually, why not, young members of Parliament, doing that? And I think if I kind of look to a kind of more localised example, so youth work, if you go and consult and work with young people, so UK Youth were saying this to us an example, they did this in terms of some youth work, and young people went and said we want more life skills, and we want stuff around budgeting, applying for mortgages, etc. And they were like, oh, right. So they went and put it on, and they were nervous whether or not people would come along or not. It was oversubscribed. So I think, fundamentally, young people are part of the solutions, not just, kind of part of the problems. And I think it's really important that we listen to, young people and make sure that it's genuine, that their voices are heard. But you went and asked me that question, but actually in some ways the question kind of goes back to you as well. You know, what do you need us to do, you know, and how can we work better to make sure that we actually do achieve that?
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll now invite James to ask the next question.
My question is to the whole panel, and is: do you think the serious violence strategy is fit for purpose? Is it compatible with the government intention to adopt a public health approach to tackling knife crime?
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Or I'll go first? Don't mind.
You
I'll go first.
You go.
Okay. Can I just add to what Vicky just said about the question before as well, if that's okay, very quickly, which is that our very first meeting we had at the All Party Group was just with kids who'd been in prison for knife offences. So we had a group of MPs, they met a group of, it was like 15 young people who'd been in prison, and it was just, we will make much better policy as a result of hearing what they said, because, for example, some of them were talking about how prison was a bit of a relief for them because they weren't on the streets and it was a safe place for them, and actually it was a bit of a rest. And to have a lot of MPs hearing people say that, when normally you'd think, well, let's, you know, lock them up, throw away the key, that's punishment, when actually the reality for them was completely different, that actually they were more dangerous. It was a more dangerous place for them to be on the streets than it was in prison, so it was quite nice to have a bit of a rest. And to hear them say, I missed my mum on my birthday, but apart from that, I got fed every day, I was safe, and that was quite shocking to hear for MPs. So hearing things from actually people's perspective is absolutely crucial for making the right policy choices. Back to your question, about the serious violence strategy. I don't think it is fit for purpose if you think it's about reducing knife crime and serious violence. It's a good piece of analysis. There's some good analysis there that looks at some of the issues that are driving some of the factors behind serious violence. But a proper strategy says this is what we want to achieve. There's nothing. There's no targets, and I keep asking the government, what do you want to do? Do you want to get, do you want to end the number of deaths? Do you want to, over what period of time? Do you want to end the number of violent attacks? Over what period of time? What is your plan? What are you aiming for? And then the other thing that the Home Affairs Select Committee have asked the government is how many children are at risk. So if you don't know what you're aiming to do and you don't know how many children are affected, how on earth can that be a strategy? It's not. And there are lots of things in there that speak of the underlying causes. So we know you're much more susceptible to violence in later life if you've experienced violence in the home, if you've experienced domestic violence or your mum's experienced domestic violence. But the strategy will just say, well, there's already strategies in place to tackle domestic violence. It's like, well, maybe there are, but you're not joining them up really at all. And the best example, I think, of the problem with the government's approach at the moment was when Vicky organised a meeting with Home Office Minister, and we went to talk about, or I can't remember why we went. The two of us went, and we were talking about something, Fences Weapons Bill, that's it. And you said something about how there was an issue with the education, that we needed to bring schools and education into part of this debate. And she said, well, that's a different ministry. You need to go and talk to them. It's like, no, the whole point is all of the government departments need to be talking to each other. Everyone needs to be joined up. And until you know what you're aiming for and what the problem is, really, and the will just isn't there. It's not a priority for government to tackle serious violence.
So I agree with all of that. I think one of the things I'd say is that there's been a shift in rhetoric in the violence strategy from enforcement and suppression to prevention, and that's very welcome. But if you follow the money, the vast majority of money is still being spent on suppression and enforcement activities. There's not much going into prevention at all. It's a drop in the ocean when you look at the overall spend by government. And one of the reasons I think it wouldn't be fit for purpose is because it's 111 pages, I think, that strategy, isn't it? So big document. How many times do you think that document references inequality? It doesn't mention it once. Not once is inequality mentioned in a document. There's 111 pages about serious violence. And we know from the research that inequality is one of the best predictors of how much violence you're going to have in a society. So for me, to have a serious violence strategy that doesn't even reference it is just absolutely astounding. And for that reason alone, I think it's significantly limited and flawed.
And I agree with everything that's been said. The only thing that I'd add is that in terms of the warm words in the document, of which there are a lot of warm words, early intervention and prevention is one of them that it states. But actually, when you see where they class early intervention and prevention, you know, it's not what I would class. So, for example, when a kid turns up at A&E and they've been stabbed, they get a youth worker. Maybe. But this is one of the things they go and showcase, you know, in terms of at times they say, oh, you know, that this is fantastic. No, don't call that early intervention and prevention. Why can't they have that youth worker before they turn up at A&E and have been stabbed? And why can't they go and work with them then to make sure actually that never happens? And so I think that there's words that are used, but we really need to kind of hammer them to say, you know, early intervention and prevention work actually really needs to be that. So we need to be starting, you know, before our kids are at school, to work with them so that by the time they start primary school, they're school ready. And that's stuff such as early childhood centres, you know, nursery schools, you know, all of that kind of work to make sure that we go and give our kids the best chances in life, because ultimately all of this is about building resilient young people who will go on and have fantastic futures and really believe in themselves that they're able to do that.
Thank you for all your contributions to that question. I'll now invite Jack to ask the next question.
So you've kind of touched upon this, but do you think the serious violence strategy and subsequent government policy announcements on tackling knife crime strike the right balance between a preventative, punitive and rehabilitative approach?
I mean, just to give an example, so they talk about these knife crime prevention orders, which is something they've introduced as a kind of preventative measure. So the idea is you do something you shouldn't be doing, or you don't necessarily, the police might even just think you are going to do something you shouldn't be doing, and they can put a prevention order on you, which might send you to some kind of rehabilitation, some kind of useful series of activities. It might say you can't go in certain areas, so if the police think you're potentially at risk if you go into certain areas, the prevention order might say you can't go into those areas physically. It could put all kinds of restrictions on you. It doesn't give you a criminal record at that point, but if you break that prevention order, so if you're a 12-year-old boy and the police say we're going to put a prevention order on you because we're worried about you going into that area, so we're going to say you can't go into that area. If you do go into that area and you get caught, you can then get a criminal record. So you'd have a 12-year-old with a criminal record who hasn't actually done anything terrible. And that's what the government is calling prevention, because they're saying what we're trying to do is get to these kids before they get to the point of actually being involved in serious violence. Now, to me, and exactly backing up what Vicky just said, that's not really prevention. Prevention is much earlier doors, and actually you might end up with a child with a criminal record which is going to completely blight their future in terms of their life chances, because they've got a criminal record that really affects, you know, how people perceive you and what you can do. And I think a lot of the answers that the government are looking for are still from the Home Office, they're still from policing, and they're not from all of the, you know, amazing youth services, all of the amazing evidence around, you know, everything's Vicky talking about, the kind of early years intervention, the impact of different things that happen to children, and what impact that has on their lives and what we need to do about it. All of that is not being funded properly at all. So child and adolescent mental health services cut by 50%, I think, since 2010. So if you're going to halve the funding you're putting into mental health, how is that prevention? You're just getting kids who are not being treated for their mental health condition. The condition gets worse. They get to the point where, you know, something kicks off, something happens, because they haven't had the treatment that they need. And, you know, you can't call that prevention. And we need a much wider funding and focus on prevention to actually make it work.
And in terms of the kind of policing element of that, you know, we keep saying, you know, we need more community police officers. You know, we cut, you know, policing. So if I take it just kind of on my local level in terms of Lewisham, we used to have in each ward of the constituency 8 police community support officers, and now we have 1 in each ward, as well as kind of all of the other cuts. But we need to make sure that we've gone and got that community policing that can build those relationships up in the local community and have that knowledge, because where are other people getting that knowledge from if people can't go to somebody that they see as a trusted person and be able to have that conversation about stuff, you know? And it's like we talk about all of this, you know, early intervention and prevention stuff, which we absolutely should be, and this is, you know, very much in terms of the long term. But in terms of the tomorrow, tomorrow we need more community support officers to be building those relationships, but also making sure that people feel safe when they're going around their local communities.
Yeah, I agree with all those things. I think, did we mention education as well, the cuts to education budgets?
No.
So, I mean, obviously, if you're talking about prevention, one of the best ways is to ensure that children have a good experience at school. That's what's going to set them up for the rest of their lives. And if we're cutting money out of the education budgets, there's less teachers in schools, then that's not going to be compensated for by small pots that go to services for a year or two. There's just no balance there whatsoever. I think that's often overlooked.
Thank you. So thank you for those contributions. And I'll now invite Husna to ask the next question.
The Commissioner's Safer Life survey found that 46% of young people responding would not go to the police if they felt worried about being a victim of a crime. Have you heard of any anecdotal experiences where young people were reluctant to go to the police? And can you offer any reasons like how we can improve this relationship?
Okay, so I can give you one example. I had a young lad who did work experience with us for a week. He'd got caught with a knife and was going to be expelled from school. His mum came and contacted me, said he's a really good lad. So I was like, yeah, okay, let's have him do work experience with us for a week and see if he is a really good lad. And I spent the week with him and he was fantastic. He was bright, on the button, absolutely brilliant. And because he spent the entire week with me, I had to take him to the police station a couple of times and had conversations because we started relaxing in them. And I said, would you go to the police on anything? And he was like, no. And I asked the kind of, reasons why. And he was talking about stop and search. And I said, have you ever been stopped and searched? And he said, no. But then he was telling, so I said, why, what's the problem with it then? And then he was saying about his friends and how they'd been aggressively stopped and searched. And then had a meeting with the former borough commander of Lewisham. And during that meeting, he got on with her really well. And then afterwards went and said, oh yeah, I'd go to her. It was a bit like, could you find someone a little less senior to go to in the future? But kind of that. But what that goes and says to me is, actually, when you're there and you can build those relationships, and this is, the kind of anecdotal stuff in terms of the police and building those relationships, then young people will feel comfortable going to those people about stuff and we'll be able to break down those barriers. But actually, in a kind of wider sense, there is a worry about the way that the police will police them rather than a recognition that actually the police want to keep people safe.
Yeah.
And again, Vicky, this goes back to cuts to police budgets, doesn't it? Because the police don't have the resources anymore to do that proactive and positive policing that they used to do. So having those positive interactions with young people in schools or at youth services or just around in the community, policing's been scaled back, and now most interactions between the police and young people are reactive and negative through the stop and searches. So it's really no surprise that young people have a bad opinion of the police when that's their main contact points.
When we asked young people, they said, the same group of young people that had been in prison, and some of them were in their kind of early 20s, and they said that they used to have had relationships with their local neighbourhood police officers when they existed in the greater numbers, because the local police officers would kind of know the area, they'd get to know the kids, they'd have a bit more of a relationship, and if you got caught doing something, maybe you shouldn't be doing, they might just take you back to your mum and not actually, they'd have that kind of trusted relationship, and I think that's really important. And I think what worries me about the increasing stop and search that we're seeing is that some of that trust will get worse rather than better, because what you want is for quite a high proportion of people who get stopped to be found with something to show that actually it is evidence based and not just random, and therefore not just slipping into something that might be what somebody looks like, rather than based on information about what they might actually be doing. And what worries me slightly about the increasing stop and search we have now in my area, we'll see wards or even the whole borough going under a section 60 which means that, you know, virtually anybody can be stopped. I worry that you'll end up stopping people because of what they look like rather than because of what the information you have about what they might have done, and that is a bad thing for trust, I think, and will not help with that relationship.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to the next question, which Thea will be presenting.
So can I direct this one at you, Sarah? The all-party parliamentary group on knife crime draws links between cuts in youth services and knife crime.
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more about these links, and also can you give us some information about how youth services are useful in keeping young people away from knife crime?
Yeah, well, so young people always say to us, oh, there's nowhere to go anymore, there's no youth services, and we know there's been big cuts to youth services, so we wanted to just look at, is there actually any evidence behind this anecdotal thing that people say. So we did a freedom of information request to all local authorities and asked them to give us information about their youth services. So the number of youth workers they had, the amount of overall funding they spent on youth work, and also the kind of the amount of money they were spending on premises as well, because one of the problems is the lack of premises. And then we mapped, well, we got Bernardo's did it for us because they had a data person who knows what they're doing. We mapped whether there was any kind of trend between the levels of increase in knife crime and the cuts to youth services, and there was an absolute direct trend. It's not the same as saying if you cut that youth service, someone will get stabbed. It's not that direct. But if you map the whole country in terms of the cuts, the areas that had the fastest growing levels of knife crime had the largest cuts to youth services. And it speaks, I think, to what Vicky said at the start, which is, you know, we know there's a peak in youth violence after school and before parents get home from work. So what can we do with those kids if they were in youth, if they were you know, occupied somewhere doing something either entertaining or useful? That would be really good, and that's what youth services provide. And there's some new models of youth work now, but you know, and some interesting new. There's an organisation on side that does these great big youth centres that are interesting and brand new and exciting, and you know, nice places for young people to go. But it's things like youth work in the community that really has been cut back. You know, so people going around and just, you know, working in the community directly with young people that can also identify risk and young people that are at risk, and then can point them in the right direction to get them help. So it's not just the buildings, it's also the people that can help young people.
So just on the on-side use zones, it might be interesting for you to do a bit more digging in terms of this. So government have gone and said that they're funding it, but actually they're not. It's you know, philanthropy, you know, kind of businesses and so forth in the local community, and then local authorities that go and commit the funding to it. So just kind of for interest.
Thank you. So I'll now invite Bailey Lee to present the next question to the panel.
So my question is, should a public health approach to knife crime and youth violence include provisions about funding for the youth services that you're talking about? So I suppose what that's asking is, because the government's committed to a public health approach, should they invest more money?
Yes. It's a short yes, but the government spends upwards of £800 billion a year. Like, that's £800,000 million. That's a huge amount of money. So when it talks about not being able to fund youth services adequately, it basically means it doesn't value the lives of the services who are delivering to young people. So, you know, this is a political choice. It's not a necessity that these services had to be cut, and I think it's scandalous that they were. And as you say, the consequences will be felt, not just in social terms, but in economic terms for years to come, because it doesn't make sense long term anyway. Because these young people, if they're not given the services and the support they need early in life, the costs will be massive later on down the line. So absolutely, it should be ring fenced, it should be statutory, and it should be long term.
The average cut from our FOI, the average cut to local authority youth services was 40%. So that was the average amount that's lost. And you get to those kind of figures, and it's not about finding efficiencies or doing things, you know, that's just taking services away. And absolutely you're right, without doing things like that and a load of other things, you can't really talk about doing a public health approach in the sense that actually means success.
So I will now invite you in to ask the next question to the panel.
My question is for Vicky. The Commission's report identifies social media as a factor which could potentially be escalating and inciting violence. You have also previously commented on the need for interrupters in the online space. Who is best placed to take on that role? Should it be the police, the social media companies, or the users of the platform, or the newly announced online regulator?
Yeah, I mean, what we went and said is that, social media, wasn't the cause of all this, but it could escalate, issues and violence at times. And we were very kind of clear on that because a lot of people were just blaming social media. I think, so the number of interruptions in terms of online space, I think is very low. Is it something like 12? I think we need loads more to be doing that. And I actually think young people are probably the best place to go and do this, as long as they've got, appropriate training and so forth to be able to, do it in the kind of right fashion. But, the truth is, like us with social media, we lose, track of what you do all the time. I quite often go and do jokes in a room, like how many people use Facebook. Actually, we'll just do it quickly. Is it just me that uses Facebook?
I still do.
Okay, how many people use Twitter? Okay, how many people use Instagram? Oh, any of the older people in the room putting their hands up? All right, and how many people use Snapchat? Right, every one of you. And that's the kind of example, like how are we supposed to say, oh, this is how we go and interrupt things when it's escalating, when actually what to do and how to do it. So I think that young people in collaboration with the police and others, need to really, kind of be a part of that.
There's just to add one thing, there's quite an interesting bit of work to be done, I think. Well, some people are looking at it in terms of drugs, not in terms of social media so much, but in terms of the dark web and the role of social media and the internet in terms of just the sale of drugs. So it's just a way you can do it much more quickly and much more efficiently, and you can escalate the quantity of criminal activity you do because of all this stuff online, and there's something to be looked at there a bit more, I think, in terms of some of the drivers around some of the violence that are associated with drug use, that we need to look at the role that the internet's playing.
Thank you. So for the next question, I'll invite Susie to ask that.
So my question is to Dr. Erwin Rogers, and it's you've previously questioned how well social media platforms manage to act on reported content containing serious violence. So would you mind expanding on this? And further to that, have there been any improvements in regard to this within the last couple of years?
So, again, agreeing with Vicky and Sarah, I think social media does play a role, and clearly it's going to play a role going forward, because that's where the vast majority of communication goes on now. If it goes on online, you'd expect that to affect offline behaviour, so there's no surprise there. But I always hesitate to talk about social media because I think it can act as a distraction from more pressing problems that are more serious than this. But you've asked the question, so I will answer it, and because I've written a paper on it, I think I'm under an obligation to do that as well. But I think I've worked with the platforms for the past 2 months with one of them. I won't name them specifically, but they seem to be wanting to play ball a lot more with their taking their responsibilities seriously. Now, whether that's because they recognise the need for them to act responsibly, or whether it's because they're under pressure from the media and politicians, is another factor. But I think they are responding, and I think they're spending more money now trying to get content back down that violates their own guidelines, and I think that's the right thing. I think policing young people's use of social media, that should be done primarily by the platforms, not the police. The guidelines are already in place on social media platforms not to have a lot of this content up there. It's just that they need to enforce that, and I think there's a danger certainly relying on the police reporting this to the platforms, because then it becomes more of a tension between young people and the police again, when it should be the platforms themselves taking responsibility for this. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you. So for the next question, I'll invite Jodie to present that to the panel.
My question is, will greater regulation of social media companies be effective in reducing the amount of violent material on the platforms, and what could this look like?
I think so. I was on the Home Affairs Select Committee for a while, and we looked at kind of hate crime generally, so not just the kind of what's on there in terms of violence that shouldn't be there, but also what's in there in terms of terrorism, in terms of Islamophobia, in terms of like really acute kind of violent and racist content. And they just weren't taking down what they should be taking down, and they weren't investing enough money. And because there was quite a big hoo-ha about it and lots of people were talking about it, they have employed more people. And then it turned out that the people that were employed were based in America and they weren't based in the UK, and they didn't really know what they were doing. And, and we've kind of been shifting them along the way to what was really completely unregulated, to I think everyone getting used to the idea now that we've got to have some kind of regulation, just like you do in the real world, as it were. You've got to have a system of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and of consequences if they don't take down things. And I think serious violence fits into that whole agenda of how do we make sure people can be safe online by not having content on there that firstly shouldn't be there, but also not driving people to that kind of content. So if you search for one thing, if as part of our select committee we were kind of searching for some kind of online terrorism, then all the suggested content is like loads of other online terrorism. it's the whole model, the way its system works, is to kind of try and push you in certain directions and to see certain things, and all of that needs looking at, and there needs to be some regulation, and I think that will help. But the underlying factors that drive serious violence won't change because the underlying factors of poverty and lack of support and all of those things will still be there.
Okay, so I'll move on to the next question, which is, do you think parents or legal guardians can be better supported to protect their children from violent crime? If so, what sort of support do you think should be offered to them?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that if you look at kind of one of our recommendations in terms of the report, it was around early childhood centres. In the past these would have been called Sure Start, that work with someone when they're pregnant and continue that work with and support all the way through, be that around preparing meals, reading to children, time management and all of those kind of things. And I think it's really important. I also think we have to realise sometimes as well that people have busy working lives, and because of that they might not be there all of the time, and rather than kind of always being aggressive kind of with those approaches, either we need to find a way that they're better financially supported so they're not having to work all the time, so that they can spend more of a balance, or we provide extra help and support in other areas. And one part of that is if your kids go into a safe youth centre in the evening, then actually you're feeling more secure that your kids going to be okay at that time. So I think support is very much kind of needed. And also I think sometimes people can feel quite frustrated, as in kind of parents, guardians and so forth, in terms of when they call out for support that they don't get it and they get pushed around the houses. By that I mean pushed around all of the different agencies until it gets really bad. And actually we need to make sure that once they've called out to whoever, and this is part of the public health approach and everybody coming together and working together, that support is provided at that stage, and that everybody, all of the different agencies, are talking with each other to make sure that it's there.
Yeah, I mean, I had an event the other day called the Great Get Together, which is a thing that was set up after Joe Cox was murdered. It's like a nice tea party idea, so everybody comes together, the community, everybody just gets on, has a chat, has a cup of tea. We had about 300 people. It was like a lovely event, really nice. I was talking to a mum, a single mum who's also disabled, who just had her PIP, her benefit system assessed, and she got a text saying, we'll let you know in 6 weeks what benefits you're going to get. And in that period of time she was only on child benefit. So I said, well, have you got any food? She said, well, no, not really. So I've got some food vouchers that I can give out for one of the food banks. So I gave her a food voucher. Somebody obviously heard that conversation, because another mum went up to someone who works in my office and said, well, we just heard that you've got some food, could we have some food? And it kept happening. People kept, and then we finished and we packed up and we were in the office and there was a knock at the door and it was 2 other mums saying, "We've heard you've got some food. Could we have some food?" Now, you know, in one sense that's nothing to do with serious violence, but in another sense it's everything to do with serious violence, because those are mums who had no food, who were, you know, their pride was less important to them than their need for food, because it's a very humiliating thing to come and ask someone for food. And, you know, if they have a son who they can't afford to buy clothes for or trainers, and if he starts wearing nice trainers, do you turn a blind eye or not? You know, if you have, you know, you're really struggling to put food on the table and your son starts producing food on the table, what do you do? You know, if you've got other children and they're getting food as well, you know, these are really difficult situations for parents. Or if, you know, your son gets in trouble, this isn't to do with poverty, this is to do with kind of knowledge of the systems as well. If your son gets in trouble at school, or your daughter, and gets, you know, temporarily excluded, what are your rights as a parent? What should you be asking the school to do? What actually, if you think your child needs more support at school, how can you voice that? So all of these things are very difficult lived experiences for people. You know, shall I tell the police that my son's involved in something? Will my other children get taken into care? Am I going to lose my other children if I make that choice? You know, these are real decisions that people are making every day. So they might know there's some problem, but it might be easier sometimes to hope for the best and turn a blind eye. And, you know, can you blame them for doing that? It's very difficult.
I agree. All of these problems are connected, aren't they? We can go around in circles and connect to all the different things we've been talking about. But one of the things that is often uncomfortable to talk about is the fact that some of these young people are involved in illicit drug distribution. We haven't talked much about, and you know, if the families are living in poverty and parents are struggling to put food on the table and pay rent and bills, then if there's a £6-7 billion drug market out there, some young people are going to be involved in that, and that brings money into households, especially when we're talking about welfare states that have been cut and education's been cut and all social services. So, you know, to me, it's not surprising we are where we are. This all makes perfectly good sense. And I think one of the things that as we haven't discussed is the reform of illicit drug markets. I don't know whether we'll come on to that, or whether you've taken evidence on that already. But I think that's another important thing to be discussed.
Thank you. So for our next question, we would just like to ask what each of you believe the government should now be focusing on as the top priority to help combat knife crime.
How many priorities can we have?
If you could just briefly describe what you think is like the top thing that they should be focusing on.
And so I guess if we were to take it today with where we are, we need a heavy investment in more community support officers, police, to try and, you know, kind of stem the rise and to start building those relationships. But actually, over the long run, that is definitely not enough, and that will just try and de-escalate kind of where we are at the moment. So when we talk about a public health approach, and was really glad to see so many questions on that, that is what we need to see happen, and that needs to be a top priority for the government. But it has to be properly resourced, you know, and that is the key thing. You know, too many times we see programme after programme resourced for a year or 2 years. It needs to be long-term resourced, not chopping and changing, unless you're chopping and changing because something's not working, so you're stopping it and doing something else that's working. But when something's working, we need to keep going with it and make sure it's got the investment it needs.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison that I always draw, because I think there's similarities, is with what the government did when we had a real problem with teenage pregnancies. We had the highest teenage pregnancies in Europe, and everyone was kind of doing that great moral panic of like, oh, these girls are having sex, they just want a council house, it's terrible, and which is a completely hopeless response. And the government introduced a 10-year strategy driven by the Prime Minister, centre, a whole unit in the Cabinet Office driving this agenda, but with local solutions, so doing things locally, but the centre kind of making sure that everything was evidence-based and that the results were there. And over a 10-year period, teenage pregnancies halved. They went down by 50%, and that is a societal shift that was substantial and hopefully permanent. And of course, it wasn't about feckless girls. It was about the conditions in which they were being brought up, and the kind of lack of aspiration, education. It was all the same kind of issues, poverty, it was the same kind of issues, and it was way beyond sex education. It was about all of the things that were going on in their lives. And by doing the right thing, by having this strategy, it was driven by the Prime Minister but delivered locally, you can get that kind of result. And I think with something like this, which is, serious violence is the tip of a big iceberg of problems, things that are going on in young people's lives. If we really want to tackle that in the long term, you've got to have it driven from the Prime Minister. And the next Prime Minister is probably Boris Johnson, and this should be his top priority, absolutely without question. And at the moment, I don't get that impression. So we'll be trying to persuade him, but it should be his top priority, and we need the funding for all the things Vicky has just said, but it needs to be a proper, we've got a plan and we're going to fund it and we know where we're trying to get to.
Yeah, I think that tackling poverty and inequality and investment in youth services are two really important issues. Because it hasn't been discussed, I'm going to put it as my top priority, and it's tackling illicit drug markets. I mean, I can't stress this enough, how often I have to say this, and I never get an adequate answer to it. We've got a £6 to £7 billion drug market in the UK, and we've got in London alone 700,000 children living in poverty. Now, if you've got that situation, many of those young people are going to end up in involvement in the drug markets at street level. And if you've got that situation, then, because they can't be regulated by contracts and courts the way we do with the vast majority of our services and goods, that means that violence comes into these markets, and that's what we see every single day. We've seen it for decades, and we'll continue to see it while nothing gets done about this. And I think, for me, I hesitate to say this, but I think the prohibitionist approach to drugs, what it does is it takes communities that are in dire poverty, and instead of supporting them and helping these vulnerable communities and individuals, it dangles a carrot in front of their face, the vast amount of money that you can go and make from drugs now. And when these kids take a bite from that carrot, they're then held up as a plague to society and kids that we need to demonise and criminalise. And I honestly think that we're going to look back at this in decades to come and just think it was shameful what we were doing. I mean, in general terms, I think that what I would advise is just to avoid minor tweaks to policy and practice, and be bold, be brave, and be more ambitious than the adults that are currently letting you down.
Thank you. Thanks for those great responses. I'll now invite Charlie to ask the next question to the panel.
Offender rehabilitation statistics show that younger people are more likely to reoffend. What should be done to ensure they receive rehabilitation after their sentence?
So we went up to Young Offenders Institute in Scotland, where they've stopped locking people up for small sentences, and they only lock up younger people for kind of very serious crime. So they've got half the numbers of people in prison, but they therefore have more capacity to invest in them while they're in prison, and actually to try and give them training. So, for example, the local fire brigade go in and do some training with people if they want it, to kind of get them first stage trained to become firemen when they come out, or you'll learn a skill. Some of the construction companies go in and teach people construction skills so that they can learn, the skills when they come out. Because the thing is, you come out of prison and you just, unless there's something there to support you, you just collapse back into exactly what you were doing before, because you need the money and you don't know anything different. So, it's only breaking that cycle that works. And in Scotland, they're having, some results from that. In our prison service, we don't, we're so overcrowded, so underfunded, not enough people working in prisons, not enough support. A lot of kids you could just be in prison, stuck in your cell all day long and barely get any exercise, let alone any kind of rehabilitation. So, prison doesn't work as rehabilitation unless you help people. And if you can help them while they're in prison before they come out, then that's great. And if you can't, then trying to give them support when they come out for things like housing. You know, because if, say, you've got family breakdown, you're homeless, you haven't got anywhere to go, you're going to get back into whatever you were doing to make some money to live somewhere.
I mean, these are the same problems that are faced by young people before they go into prison, aren't they? They're just intensified by that prison experience. I mean, one of the things, I'm not sure we've spent too much time talking about it, but it's just the lack of decent employment for young people now. The fact that so many kids are having to go into fixed-term poverty wage employment with real no hope on the horizon for any stable future. I mean, it wasn't always like that. Kids who didn't do well in school used to be able to at least have certain jobs in, for example, manufacturing and industry that they would never pay unbelievable wages, but they'd always be secure and stable jobs, and you'd feel like you had a sense of status and you were contributing to society, and that's a decent life. Now kids who don't do well in school, well, there really isn't that much there on offer, and that's a really big problem that faces, this goes way beyond youth violence, actually. But these are the same problems that face young people coming out of, for example, secure estate and young offender institutions, housing, employment, really crucial issues.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said by both of them, and making sure that when people come out that they're, secure, that they're not just pushed straight into, needing to do, what they did before because they haven't got housing, they haven't got money. And that's making sure, trained with, the skills to be able to get employment, but also finding those employers that will be willing to employ them, and that's exactly what we saw when we went up to Scotland.
Thank you. So I'll now invite Bailey Lee to ask the next question to the panel.
Yep, I've just got 2 follow-ups. So the first one's for you, Sarah. So going back to what you said earlier, last week we had the Home Office Miss Atkins here, and before the committee, and she basically echoed that knife crime is a government priority, and that was even if there was a new Prime Minister. Do you disagree with this?
I think you've got to follow the evidence, isn't it? The funding is not there at the moment. There has been a shift, as we've said, in terms of the way people talk about the problem, and that is a good thing. So there is much less talk of hang 'em and flog 'em and lock 'em up and throw away the key, they're evil, and there is much more talk of let's understand what the drivers are, and let's, the victim and the perpetrator could be, it's not that one's good, one's bad, they could be, it's just luck of who gets stabbed and who doesn't. So I think there's been a good shift in terms of language, but in terms of money, we just haven't seen that. We just haven't seen it. And what has been so, I think, painful about this process of who the next Prime Minister is going to be is the way that people are throwing around these huge sums of money and saying, right, we're going to recruit 20,000 more police, is what Boris has said. And it's like, well, why did you cut them in the first place? If money is no option, it's no problem, and you can afford, some of the most, I think, wrong things that they're suggesting about cutting taxes for very well-off people. What on earth are your priorities? If you can cut taxes for people on, £100,000 and you can't put money into youth services, what are your priorities? They're not the right ones, and you can't claim that youth violence is a priority. And it's used as a political kind of football, and do Tories blame Sadiq, and all of that kind of stuff, which is just pointless. It's like it doesn't care what kind of political party happens to be in power. We're not doing the right things now. We need to do the right things, and I think we're certainly not at the moment.
Yeah, and the next follow-up is to you, Vicky. So coming back to the interrupters, do you believe that the new online regulator, which was in the online harms white paper by the Home Office, do you think that's got a part to play in helping to tackle youth violence and knife crime on social media?
Yeah.
And how do you think that should look?
I wouldn't want to just kind of say in terms of the detail on that right now without kind of looking a little bit more. Yeah.
That's fine.
I just want to kind of follow on in terms of kind of what Sarah went and said on the stuff. The government adopt a public health approach, and they say that they have, and kind of this kind of links with the teenage pregnancy stuff as well. And teenage pregnancy stuff very much led by the Prime Minister. So public health approach, is it being led by the Prime Minister? Are all of the departments bought into it? I was asking every single department what they're doing in terms of the public health approach. The Health Secretary of State didn't know what the public health approach was and didn't know that his government had adopted it. So that just kind of, gives you the example. And there are a ton of other examples similar to that, like when we were having the meeting with Victoria Atkins and talking about, building trust between young people and police, and we were saying, maybe we could do some projects, in schools, test them, where, kind of young people go and, talk about how we could, better keep online safety. So we were talking about projects like this, and she was like, great idea, you need to write to the Education Secretary. We're like, where is your public health approach? Surely you should be able to have this conversation somewhere. Anyway.
Thank you. And for our next question, I'll invite Ewan to ask that.
There's another follow-up for Vicky. Before we talk about interrupters and online regulators, I was just wondering, who do you think should be responsible for enabling and putting this facility into place?
Who should be? Well, I think, I think there needs to be more of a kind of discussion around, how that should happen, and, really kind of work with, young people to make sure that we, kind of get it right. But I think it needs to be a combination of, young people, the social media people, the police, schools. It really kind of needs to, be everybody working kind of together to make sure that we go and get it right as we go and expand it out.
Okay. For our next question, I'll invite Jack to ask that question.
So my question to the entire panel, and it's how effective are positive role models in deterring young people from criminal activity? We've heard from the Minister that maybe having things like athletes and rappers would be positive. I wonder your opinion on that and who you believe are the best people to act as role models.
I think role models are important, but they don't put food on the table, and do you know what I mean? There's bigger structural issues at play here. Now, who is going to influence a young person? Absolutely, you need trusted adults that will be there for them and that they can talk to, and that they can try and emulate, and maybe their parents, maybe their teachers, maybe their youth workers, maybe their people in their communities. And I think one of the really sad things about the way that a lot of the services have been stripped away is a lot of those adults that might have been the trusted adults that you could have looked up to, that could have said, well, I hear what you're saying about that, but have you thought about maybe doing this instead? They've been stripped away. So you can Croydon, I am Stormzy, right? Stormzy is from Croydon. He's a fantastic role model in many ways. Had a difficult experience in his youth. Has managed to be very successful, and a lot of kids in Croydon want to be the next Stormzy. Some of them might, but not everyone can. And you can't. We need to make sure people are having the conversations with them about, well, you want to get into the music industry. Have you thought about music production, or have you thought about something that in case you don't get to be the next Stormzy? But these people are influential, of course they are, especially the online, all these influencers that young people watch and listen to. They are important, but they're not those trusted adults, and they're not a substitute for all the other stuff that young people need in order to make the right choices.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. Role models can come in all shapes and sizes, can't they? And I think we spent time with lots of youth services, and I've been in pupil referral units and AP before, and sometimes they've got some fantastic adults working in those institutions. My problem with PRUs and AP isn't with the adults that are working in there, who I think can be fantastic role models, and the reason they go and work there is because they want to help young people, and they often do really help those young people in those institutions. But systemically, when we're pouring lots of young people from mainstream into those institutions together, that's another huge one we haven't really discussed today, is it? The pupil referral units and AP. Yeah. I think obviously young people do need role models, but as Sarah said, that there are bigger structural problems here, and they are the fact that even if you've got a decent role model, it's very difficult to go on and get whatever job it is you want to get, because there's such a lack of opportunity for young people in many different areas of employment at the moment. And that's a bigger problem, I think, that we have to address. So it's like social media. I'd kind of tempted to say this could become something of a distraction from more pressing problems.
I think stuff like mentors and making sure that people have got positive peer mentors that they can work with, that they can have discussions with, that they can, voice their concerns, excitements, ask all of the questions that we all know. The first time you ever do anything in your life, it can be quite nerve-wracking if it's something outside of the normal. So being able to speak to kind of other people about that, like the first time you give evidence to loads of young people, it can be quite nerve-wracking, but then after a couple of times it gets easier. But you know what I mean, like just being able to have those relationships. And I think kind of when we spoke at the start about relationships being really important in terms of the public health approach, I think that's the same as making sure that we have, those mentors and relationships that are strong and really can be life-changing.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank all our three panellists for all the evidence that you've given us today and all the useful contributions. So this brings us to the end of this session. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Order.
Cheers.
Proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.